Hey, what's going on? Welcome to a video. We're going to be reacting today. I saw a couple tweets come through actually over on Twitter about this particular video. It's not really, I guess, I don't even know what to call it. It is put out by NBC, and it's something they did on Christian nationalism. And I thought it was incredibly interesting piece and sort of what they included. So I just want to go through it. I mean, this is just going to be us going through the piece because I found it rather interesting. And the reason I found it interesting is because I haven't done like a ton of research, like at all, on like Christian nationalism, anything like that. I've read tweets, I've read some statistics, I've heard people like define it and talk about it. I've seen all the hoo-ha over on Twitter and some other social media platforms, but not a whole lot of, like, I haven't read any books, right? There's been a lot of reading of books, I'm sure. So what I found with this report is like, this is how most people are going to get like an intro to what Christian nationalism is. So I thought, let's look at it and just sort of work through it. Now, this particular report, I'll put the link in the description, so you'll be able to get that after the live. If you're watching on replay, it should be below. It's 27 minutes long. So I'm going to expect that this video is going to be like an hour or so. So just kind of buckle your seatbelts. That's what you are. I'm going to lock my chair here. This is what you're signing up for. So let's go ahead and start because I want to get through it. And it's called Christian Nationalism, The Clash of Worlds. Again, this was from NBC. This video is obviously not going to be able to be monetized ad-wise because it's NBC and they'll take the whole video down. I don't even know if this video will be up after they see it. But anyway, if you want to support, the links will also be in the description below after the live. So let's go ahead and get into it, and then we'll kind of talk about it as we go.
Welcome. You have made it to episode 1 of season 5 of Meet the Press Reports. Thanks for being here. Theocracy. It isn't a word you often hear in American politics these days, but given the religious rhetoric coming from some Republican candidates this year, it doesn't feel as far-fetched or hyperbolic as it would have been in the past. Frankly.
So just to note, like right away, this starts off with this idea of theonomy, right? Theocracy. You're going to see this a lot through this report, like this just being brought up as like this is sort of the big issue, basically, of the upcoming midterms is kind of how they frame it. And then also like the presidential election in 2024. But like it's a setup interesting. Like this is like a big deal as far as they're portraying it. So just kind of that's the feel of we're opening here. Like all of these have covered it. We'll get into it a little bit more. I just want to like state that like that's from the beginning. Like, oh, here's
it feels
theonomy.
Possible. There are candidates embracing the idea that whatever the First Amendment actually says about the free exercise or establishment of religion, that this wall between church and state should actually come down. And not only that, these folks argue the wall was actually never supposed to be there in the first place. In fact, here's Lauren Boebert. She's a freshman member of Congress from Colorado.
So real quick, I've tweeted about Lauren Boebert, is how you say her name before. This lady right here, I don't know where she goes to church, if she goes to church. If she goes to church somewhere, let me just say out of the gate, somebody needs to sit her down and talk to her about proper biblical interpretation. Because this lady says some like nutty things about the Bible. So let's just be really clear out front about that in regards to her use of exegesis and whatnot.
She was speaking this summer to congregants. Here's what she said.
The church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church. That is not how our founding fathers intended it. And I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk.
She's not alone. The Republican candidate for governor in Pennsylvania, the nation's 5th most populous state, said this to his supporters.
So much for this myth of separation of church and state.
So can we... So I just want to put this out here. One of the reasons I do like reaction videos like this, one of the reasons I do the sermon reviews the way I do them is so that it's in context. Now, again, dude's got an American Eagle tie on. There was some Bible verse. So I'm sure it's not like he's totally out of context. But when you're when you literally play 2 seconds of somebody's stuff, that's like that's not helpful. But anyway, he's a candidate. I think we need to make like those distinctions clear. Lauren Boebert is actually a representative. Doug here is a candidate, so he's running for office.
That's right. And that's the same position that Michael Peroutka, the Republican nominee for Maryland Attorney General.
He's also a nominee.
It's a position he's taken since at least 2014 when he called the separation of church and state, quote, the great lie. And he added, there can be no separation of God from government because he, capital H there, created it. That would have been news to the founders, especially Thomas Jefferson.
So one real quick before we get too far into it. So they've sort of laid these out. They're going to play a clip here in a minute of Marjorie Taylor Greene. Also, somebody if she goes to church somewhere, her pastor needs to sit her down and be like, "Look, Marjorie, we need to teach you some hermeneutics. We need to teach you some exegetical. Like we need to yeah." So using them is a little weird, but whatever. They are representatives and they do have power, so that's legitimate. But one of the things that's sort of being missed here, and we're going to see throughout here, is that, and one of the things that's missed, I think, a lot, is that if you hold any belief, you operate out of that belief. So even though I would say Lauren Boebert, or however, I'm just going to call her Lauren, is nutty in regards to her exegetical work, she is operating out of what she thinks to be correct understanding, which is why, again, I think her pastor needs to sit her down and be like, hey, Lauren. So anyway, I just want to make that like everyone, like it's going to be presented that these Christians are operating out of like a worldview and nobody else does that, which isn't true. Everybody operates out of their worldview. Everybody's going to vote based on their worldview. Everybody brings up bills based on the worldview. Like all of this is worldview.
Who was the first of the founders to use the phrase, the wall of separation metaphor, to describe the First Amendment's religious freedom protections. Other Republicans, though, are openly embracing Christian nationalism.
We need to be the party of nationalism, and I'm a Christian and I say it proudly. We should be Christian nationalists.
Even the Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade has religious overtones.
So real quick, he said other Republicans are embracing Christian nationalism. So he presented Lauren Boebert, and then two people that are not representatives, but they're candidates. And then he said other Republicans, and Marjorie Taylor Greene is the representative for the Republican Party. Which I don't know a lot about politics, but from what I do know, like there's a good group of people that apparently don't like her. I don't know a ton about her, but I don't think she would be a representative, quote unquote, for the Republican Party. Again, don't know a lot about politics, but I think that's safe in saying that.
Overtones. It has been cheered on by conservatives on religious grounds. And in fact, it's actually led some liberals to look to the religious freedom restoration laws, many of them vigorously opposed over the last decade, to use these laws as an attempt to challenge these statewide abortion bans that are being passed around this country. So, as a country, we are entering unknown territory. What is next? Where is this movement heading? My colleague, NBC News correspondent Ann Thompson, traveled to Moscow, Idaho. It's a blue enclave, small blue.
Okay, so now we're going to Doug Wilson, which, regardless of how you feel about Doug Wilson, I guess he is at least in NBC's view. I don't know, maybe this isn't everybody's view, but at least in NBC's view, he is sort of the figurehead of what would be considered Christian nationalism. And that's important to remember. So we're going to, this interview is like 12 minutes long. And then at the end, there's like a roundtable discussion in which they talk about Christian nationalism. But you have to understand, like the front end of this is sort of the framing of the argument, right? So what is Christian nationalism? So NBC's framing that up for us, especially those of us, for example, like that don't know a lot about it, the general public that doesn't know a lot about it. This is sort of the framing of Christian nationalism. So Lauren and Marjorie Taylor Greene and the other representatives, or the other candidates for representatives, are sort of the figureheads politically, and then NBC is bringing us to Moscow and then interviewing Doug Wilson as sort of the religious figurehead of Christian nationalism. So there's sort of a two sort of face front here, I guess. So let's go ahead. This is actually pretty interesting. I don't know why they chose Doug Wilson other than maybe he's the most outspoken in regards to Christian nationalism. But this is a very interesting interview.
Blue enclave, in an otherwise ruby red state that has been grappling for years with questions about the role religion should play in the public square and everyday life.
In northern Idaho's dunes of grains and grass, a battle without bullets over the direction of a town.
I believe that what's happening in Moscow is a microcosm of what's happening all across the country that started here maybe 10 or 15 years earlier than what's happening across the country.
And that is?
Well, just the radical division. I don't think our nation has been this divided since 1859. It's divided and it's inflamed. And that whole process, I think, began to be visible here a decade or a decade and a half before it became radically visible in the nation as a whole.
Pastor Doug Wilson.
So real quick, I mean, that's a fairly accurate statement. I don't even if you don't like Doug Wilson, I think we could all agree on that statement that it's fairly divided. You go on Twitter, you go online at all. Even the stuff that used to be online, like arguments that used to be online, are also now in the workplace in regards to, like, you'll have people that'll discuss politics and it can get a little heated sometimes, right, on break or lunch. Maybe you've experienced that. Maybe you haven't. I know people that don't even talk to their family anymore because of politics. So, like, it is one of those things where I think his statement is accurate. I didn't know that Moscow had been going through it a decade earlier. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's just Doug's assessment. But the reality is, there is a split, right? So this split, again, understand within the context of this piece, is Christian nationalism versus everyone else. So let's keep going. She's going to kind of explain who Doug is.
Leads Christ Church in what he calls a Cold War civil war.
Our rights come to us from God and not from the government.
Fighting in, of all places, a college town. Moscow, home to University of Idaho and just 8 miles from Washington State University, exudes a live and let live vibe.
One of the interesting things about Moscow is how these two entities live side by side, and I mean literally. Right behind me, that's the offices of the Christ Church, and right next door is the headquarters for the local Democratic Party.
Not anything to do with this piece, or I didn't know Doug Wilson met in a theater. I always assumed it was like a brick and mortar church, but hey, all right. Oh, come on now.
From this former art house movie theater, Wilson leads his campaign to make Moscow a Christian town.
Idaho is a very red state. Moscow was historically a very blue dot in this red state. And so consequently, the fact that we've done this has been disruptive in the minds of some, but the feasibility of evangelizing in Moscow had to do with the importance of the university and the size of the town.
So in your version of a Christian town, would there be a place for non-believers?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Would there be a place for same-sex couples?
What, you mean legally?
Yes.
You mean like marriage?
Mm-hmm.
No marriage. But there'd be same-sex couples.
No marriage, even though it's the law of the land in the...
So I'd be really interested to see what he was going to say there before she was trying to clarify her question, right? So he was saying that there wouldn't be legalized LGBTQ marriages within Moscow, but he said that obviously there'd be people that lived there that disagreed with what Christianity believed. So it's not him kicking everybody out. Now I do say that, like, there's going to be a lot of people that are like, what do you mean there's not going to be any legalized marriage? I think what he's saying, again, he doesn't get to clarify, is that none of the churches are going to perform LGBTQ plus weddings, which, again, I don't think if you're new to this channel, you may not know, but everybody that's not new to this channel knows that Christian churches shouldn't be performing LGBTQ weddings anyway. So I think that's what he's saying in regards to, no, there wouldn't be any churches here that would, do a ceremony to legalize that marriage. Now, she does point out that what she's saying, to clarify here, is she's asking him, so even though it's United States law that you can have LGBTQ plus weddings, you would still say no. And this is what his response is.
United States.
Just like Roe used to be, right? In my belief system, in our doctrinal stand and what we believe the Bible teaches, homosexuality is not only a choice, but a sinful one. Yes.
It is a muscular, masculine-led vision of Christianity.
Now, I don't want to let that last part go, right? So one of the things that you're going to see they have issue with is him saying that LGBTQ plus, like homosexuality, is a sin. Now, there's going to be Christians, like, let's just get this out of the way, that are going to disagree with Doug on the choice part, all right? They're going to contend with him on that. But the second part, right, this is where I think the second part you can find unity with him, maybe you still can't find unity with him. Again, this piece is posing him as the figurehead of Christian nationalism. So what he's saying is that in Moscow, if it was a Christian city, they would obviously have people there that were living there that did not believe the same way, but the churches there would not perform homosexual marriages, despite what the state says, the government says, because the churches would be doing what most churches do now, which is not perform gay LGBTQ plus homosexual weddings. And now we're going to switch. Okay. Now I just want to, this is why I stopped it here, because that's going to be one of their issues. And now we're switching over to Doug's patriarchal sort of, well, you'll see. Here we go.
Christianity.
Scripture tells the man to provide, protect, and love. Scripture tells the woman to honor, help, and submit.
Expounded on his show Man Rampant.
Men are going to be dominant no matter what you do.
And articulated in his blogs. This one saying marriage is a little kingdom and the husband is a little king.
A wife should be submissive to her husband, as Paul teaches in multiple places, yes. So a wife should be submissive to her husband. But in the blog post that you just cited, I made a special point of saying that the woman exercises authority over the selection of the one that she's going to submit to.
So when you say wives should be submissive to their husbands, does this mean, why shouldn't they be equal?
Well, because God created us a certain way. So we want to fit with the design.
Former Mayor Nancy Cheney.
That was unintentional, but it worked out really well. So before we get to the mayor part, so I just want to see, again, this is framed. So what they're framing Christian nationalism as is obviously like figureheads in the government, like Lauren and Marjorie Taylor Greene. And then in the church sphere, they are framing Doug Wilson as sort of the church figurehead of Christian nationalism. Here's Doug Wilson. This is Christian nationalism. This is where Christian nationalism stands. And two things are like abundantly clear that they're demonstrating like these are sort of pillars of Christian nationalism. One of them being, against LGBTQ plus weddings, marriages, that sort of thing. And then also like this patriarchal, complementarian sort of view of submission as we see in Scripture. Now, one of the things that you're going to note is that like this is going to come into play later. Okay. So just, again, keep this in your mind. This is all sort of a setup, or not a setup, but like an unpacking of what the discussion's going to be. So we're not going to talk a ton about Lauren Boebert or Marjorie Taylor Greene again. Almost this entire piece is on the church side of Christian nationalism, the figurehead being basically Doug Wilson here. So if you're a Christian nationalist, basically you align with Doug Wilson as sort of the picture that's being painted, that he is against LGBTQ plus marriages, and that he is for submission of the wife, and basically what they're going to call it is patriarchy, right? So let's keep going.
He says the community has endured decades of Wilson's often incendiary ideas.
When some kind of outrageous statements were made early on about Southern slavery as it was, as a mutually affectionate relationship between master and slave, or saying that members of our LGBTQ community, trans people, should be exiled or possibly stoned, that catches our attention.
Wilson says he was misunderstood, rebutting the many controversies on his website.
Now, I don't have the link for this. I'm sure you could find it. I do want to post, I'll post down in the description after this live, so it'll be available for everybody watching the replay, a podcast he did. Again, it's not a hard-hitting podcast. It's a podcast done by apparently somebody that has a podcast that goes to his church. But he does, at least, you can hear him, whether you believe him or not is beside the point. But he does go through a lot of the issues they bring up in this piece and talk through them. Now, again, I was not impressed by the podcast because I thought it was very it wasn't hard hitting. It didn't like really push him to answer a lot, but he does at least go through a lot of these issues and at least answer them. So if you're looking for at least a little bit of an answer, it's like a 4-part series. I'm sure this website, which I don't see them citing it either, but I'm sure you can find it, apparently discusses this as well. But again, remember, Christian nationalism, church figurehead, Doug Wilson, patriarchy against LGBTQ, and then like these issues here.
Writing he does not believe in the death penalty for homosexual acts or that slavery was a positive good. But the visible and invisible lines being drawn here and elsewhere across the country are setting off alarm bells for many faith leaders.
Do you consider Christ Church a church?
I don't.
Really?
I really don't.
What is it then?
I see it as a dominionist cult.
Reverend Dr. Elizabeth Stevens leads the Unitarian Universalist Church of the...
Okay, so this is important to note, all right? She's the pastor of a Universalist Unitarian church. Now, I'm not going to go into all the discussion of what a Universalist Unitarian church is. You can look it up as far as the association. They have a site about the Association of Universal Unitarian Churches. Basically, it's like a catch-all. Like, they don't really believe any hard, fast rules about anything. It's kind of like, hey, if you want to be spiritual, but even if you're not and you just want a community, we're here. So I just say that to say this. Christians, Orthodox Christians, would not consider her church a church. So like it's very important because what you're going to see later on in the panel is that many people that are outside of the church that hear about the church but haven't been involved in the church, haven't been catechized, haven't been taught the Gospels, have a very loose connection with Christianity, and that's a big junk drawer term for them, would put Doug and her in the same kind of category of church, even though clearly Doug and her disagree and would obviously excommunicate each other, but they don't believe the same thing. But so they're interviewing her, and I don't know if they're interviewing her knowing her views and using her as the exact opposite of Doug, or if they're literally just, they found a church in Moscow that hates Doug, or just they found a church in Moscow and ask her opinion. I think journalistic wise, they have to know that her views are super duper opposed to Doug Wilson's views, and that's why they ask her. I don't know though. So I don't want to assume anything, but the point is that you need to know, and I think a lot of people that watch this aren't going to know, especially if they're not connected or very loosely connected with Christianity, is that universal Unitarianism is like a soup. Like there's nothing hard and fast as far as meat in there, as far as doctrine goes. And you can look that up. Don't take my word for it. Look it up. But the point is that this is like asking somebody from a different religion entirely about Christianity.
The pollutes.
In the public square, I don't see them representing Christianity. I don't see them representing the values that I find in the Bible. I see them representing patriarchy. I see them fighting the culture war.
Stephen's position in that war is visible for all to see. A stained glass rainbow chalice.
So, I mean, you can see, right? So the idea is that you're going to see they're diametrically opposed. They've already asked Wilson about his views on LGBTQ+. He's already stated them. Now they're asking her. They're stating hers. These are two different things. And they're setting that up as like polar opposites within Christianity when that's not actually an accurate statement.
Wilson fights with the printed word. A prolific author, he's written dozens of books, all distributed by his own Canon Press. It publishes more than 1,000 different titles. half of which are books and materials serving hundreds of thousands of homeschool and Christian students nationwide.
Now, I don't want to make assumptions, right? But we're viewing this video, and I'm trying to view this as somebody that is as like just watching it on my couch while I eat dinner with my family that doesn't have a lot of connection with church. Clearly, I can't separate myself fully from that. But when I'm watching this, there are certain things that are built in here that are deliberately made to like make connections. So this idea of homeschooling, Christian education is directly being connected to Doug Wilson, which other things have already been connected to Doug Wilson as regards to patriarchy, as regards to LGBTQ plus, against that. And then all of this is being wrapped up into Doug Wilson as sort of the face of Christian nationalism. So if you deduce this, like if I'm just here listening and I'm not really trying to, process through it or think through it, and I'm just intaking this information, the idea is that I'm going, okay, well, Christian nationalists are against LGBTQ plus. They are patriarchs. They want to homeschool the kids. They want to use curriculum from this guy to do so. So, like, all of these things are putting a lot in the negative category for me as someone that's just watching this, and that's interesting, right? From a standpoint of just observing, that's pretty interesting that all of that's sort of being tied to Wilson.
Wilson laughs off the cult accusation, but the former Navy man embraces culture warrior.
You can't have a naval warfare without ships, and you can't have tank warfare without tanks. And as I tell Christians all around the country, you can't have culture war unless you have a culture. Our tagline is all of Christ for all of life. So we want to be 7-day-a-week, 24-hour Christians in everything we do, and a distinctively Christian culture is forming here. And not reclusive and not cultic, but it's distinct.
Here in Moscow,
So that's an important note. Like, let's talk about that just for a second, okay? Whenever Christians get together and study the Bible, worship together, live in fellowship with one another, actually disciple, Titus 2 sort of stuff. Read that, right? Older men discipling younger men, older women discipling younger women, this community growing. There is going to be something that comes out of that. Now, later in this piece, they're going to call that fundamentalism, right? Because that's been labeled as bad. But the idea here is that when cultures form, which, like, you don't even have to have Christian, like any culture that forms, their identity starts to become very solidified, and then that naturally makes its way into whatever surrounding culture they are in, because there's going to be a de facto culture war. There's always culture war. So whenever people are like, well, we can't fight the culture war, like you're doing it. Like without even knowing you're doing it, you're fighting the culture war, because your beliefs you're trying to inject into the culture around you because you want those beliefs to be predominant. Like the one thing I don't think we think about a lot is like everybody does this. Everyone does this. So when Christians get together, if I'm with my local church and we gather together and we sing together and we're all, we have jobs and we have activities and our kids go to school and they're involved in those, and all of these activities are interacting, that Christian teaching, that belief, that thing that affects your life is going to eventually go into the culture if you actually believe it, if you actually live by it. So it's like, it's interesting that they're like, well, you want to take over. And it's like, well, we're living together and we are doing things. I think it's important to note, church history-wise, the early church was considered a cult. Now, for different reasons, obviously, we have a different terminology and definition for that than they would have maybe, but it's still at base. There's still things that when the Roman culture looked at Christians, they were like, these people are different. Like, they're odd. They're weird. They considered them a cult because the Christians did things differently. They interacted with the society around them differently. Everything they did was different than the culture around them. So if we're actually living out Christ-like lives that follow the scriptures, we're going to be different, and that will affect culture. So he isn't wrong there. If you're going to live, you're going to have a culture, and it's going to come in contact with the culture around you. So anyway, let's keep going.
Wilson and Christ Church have built a multi-million-dollar enterprise that includes a K-12 school, a publishing house, a college, and a streaming show. Pursuits that some worry will change the very character of this town.
What scares me is that he is making Moscow into a Wilson town.
Keely Emerine Mix is a former pastor.
Where is
I don't know if they did this on purpose. This is just something I'm seeing. The only two pastors they reference in this entire piece are two women pastors that are automatically going to have issue with Doug Wilson. So that's interesting. Like, again, I don't know the intent here. I could guess, but I don't want to assume. But it's interesting that these are the two pastors they pick. A former pastor, which happens to be a lady, and another pastor that's currently pastoring that is a lady, that out of the gate are going to have issue with Doug Wilson. So interesting choice of people to interview.
me is not that the stamp of Christ might be wrongly shoved down the throats of my neighbors here in Moscow, but that the stamp in the foot of Doug Wilson will be wrongly and is being wrongly crammed down their throats or standing on their neck. I think that his influence on this town has been despicable.
Aubrey and Wyatt Knickerbocker met 2 years after her family moved to Moscow, seeking a Christian town.
We found what at first we thought was a very welcoming community. There was something every.
Now, it's said that she moved here with her parents looking for a Christian community. From what I understand, and I don't know a ton, again, what I've looked into, a lot of people have moved to Moscow in order to be part of Christ Church. The piece references that. She apparently met her boyfriend, husband, I'm not sure what he is, to her after they moved there. I'd be interested to know if her parents still attend Christ Church or not. I mean, clearly she doesn't, but I'd be interested if her parents do.
Every day, something new, some sort of baby shower or something for the school. You get very swept up in all of it.
Until they heard this message from another pastor in the church.
Women should wear women's clothes. They shouldn't wear pants.
Shouldn't have short hair.
Shouldn't have short hair. Men shouldn't wear earrings. No one should have tattoos.
And then there was this, a psalm sing in the middle of the pandemic, protesting the local mask mandate, retweeted by then President Trump.
That was when I realized that these were not people trying to spread awareness or trying to spread the good news of Christ. It was people trying to.
So two things there. One is more important than the other. Them pointing out that it was retweeted by Trump is a direct connection. Again, you have to understand, as I'm watching this, I would hope that when you watch things, whether you agree with them or not, when you watch them, you're trying to process through them. Okay, what is this show trying to tell me? What narrative is it trying to give me? So whether that be NBC, Fox, CNN, whatever other show you watch, there's obviously motive behind it, right? There's a doctrine of belief behind whatever anyone is saying. So my hope is that you're trying to process things that way whenever they're presented to you. And so when I'm watching this, that's what I'm thinking, okay, Doug Wilson is the figurehead church-wise of Christian nationalism. He's opposed to LGBTQ plus marriages and relationships. He's patriarchal. His church was retweeted by Trump. His church, did a hymn sing during the mask mandates. And so there's all of this sort of connectivity that's being brought together under the banner of this is what Christian nationalism looks like in the church, which is interesting. And they will actually discuss all of that here on the second part of the piece.
Say, look at us, we are so oppressed.
Did you feel betrayed when you realized that? How would you describe your feelings?
Yes, very betrayed, because I've grown up in the Christian church, and it never occurred to me that a church could be wrong and how wrong they could be.
They stopped attending Christ Church. Aubrey says she was attacked online. Now they actively avoid patronizing businesses run by church members.
If it was another church that owned it and they just happened to have some beliefs that I didn't agree with, that's fine. But when you're hurting people, that's when you have really crossed many lines.
Are you being judged on your faith rather than your product?
I believe 100% that that's true.
Josh Flickner says he came to Moscow seeking a Christian community and found it in Christ Church.
Now, the important thing to note here is that apparently, again, from what little I know and from what they're sort of reporting this piece, not only does Doug have a bunch of things in Moscow as far as Canon Press and everything they do, a lot of the church members are very entrepreneurial. That's sort of what they're painting here. They have quite a few businesses within Moscow as far as, again, they're creating culture. Like, this is what Doug already said. This is something that flows through the church anyway. There's a culture that is created, and apparently there's quite a few people, I guess, of the 2,000 people that go to Doug's church that are entrepreneurial. This is one such individual.
Church. But his business, Journey's End Cafe, is paying the price for where he worships.
I really wanted this place to be actually a bridge builder in the community. And so, yeah, it's really a bummer that that a lot of people in the community are just so full of bigotry that they do not want to even try to build those bridges.
He says his workers are threatened by crank calls and his future by a social media campaign calling out businesses run by church members.
Look at what people say about my business and then pretend like I was not a white heterosexual Christian male. That would be a hate crime. Anywhere else in the country, against any other type of person, that would be a hate crime.
3 weeks after this interview, Flickner.
Now, they're going to say that he had to close down his business. What I would be interested in, and they don't seem to show it, is like, what are those comments, right? Because all the time, and sometimes fairly, Christians get told that, you have a persecution mindset and you're not really persecuted. You're making it up so you feel better about, doing whatever you're doing. He makes that claim flat out. So it'd be interesting to know what those comments were. Like, is he accurate or is he just sort of projecting? They don't show those though. And to be frank, I might be able to find them if I did enough research. I didn't do that, but it'd be interesting to know what those comments were, because he does
he's
close down
the cafe.
So how close is Wilson to reaching his goal of turning Moscow into a Christian town? Well, no one is quite sure, but everyone has an opinion.
Honestly, it's almost laughable, only because you're talking about a minute percentage of the population.
George Scandalos and Brandy Sullivan own restaurants and businesses on Main Street.
As someone who was served on the city council, I haven't seen any traction gained in that area. The last two elections, there were some candidates who were members of Christ Church, and those elections were very uneven. And
I would call it a landslide.
There you go.
In defeat?
Yes.
You have 700.
So that's interesting there. And that'll be discussed again in the second half of this panel. This video is going to be a little bit more longer than an hour, clearly. So that's important to note, though, is that even the people in the town are like, yeah, the businesses that, Doug's, church members run are not, I mean, they're avoided. If you disagree with them, you just don't go there. And then apparently anybody that kind of runs for office there doesn't even get close to getting in. So that's important to note, because the accusation is that Doug wants to take over Moscow, and he's well on his way of doing that. But like, what we see from the interviews is that's not true. Like, they're basically they're blacklisted. So that I would think would be the goal, right, of those that are wanting to stop Christian nationalism or Christians getting into office to do all of the things that they've, patriarchy, anti-LGBT, and, teaching kids Christian teaching, like those things the town seems to be successful in staving those off, according to the people that are there.
Active households, about 2,000 church attendees. This is a city of 25,000 people. Is the way to reach your goal to bring in more people, or to convert the hearts and minds of those who already live here?
It would be both. Yeah, we would want to persuade the people who are already here, and we want to welcome the people who arrive here.
Like many other churches, Wilson's deals with accusations of sex abuse, including a deacon this summer pleading.
So this is where it's an interesting thing to include, but I know why I get why they do it, because they're like, hey, this church isn't perfect. Look at what's going on. Again, though, these are valid concerns, 110%, but they are also answered in that podcast I referenced before that I'll link afterwards for the replay. That it's like a four-part podcast, and in that podcast, I know he discusses one of these things. I think he discusses both of them, which, again, if you're fair, even, balanced, you want to hear both sides, that'd be something you want to listen to.
pleading guilty to a federal charge of child pornography, and Wilson marrying a released child molester to a church member.
The thing that upsets people is not the child molestation offense, because there are 20, 30 sex offenders in Moscow, and everybody knows the name of one of them because of where he goes to church. Right? The ones who don't go to church, they're all okay. They stay out of the newspapers. But the one who is repentant and wants to live right and is, straightened out, we're going to go after him because this is because the target is actually me.
Wilson, if anything, seems energized by the criticism and attention and undeterred from his goal.
Do you see expanding this microcosm from Moscow to the full United States?
It's hard to envision how that might happen. I think it would be wonderful if it did. So if there were a reformation and a revival, that's something we pray for regularly. And if what is happening here caught fire and spread elsewhere, I would be very, very grateful.
We're going to look at how these dynamics are playing out in politics and how the forces of Christian nationalism are.
Okay, so that's the end of the Wilson piece. Now this is going to fade out and fade back in, and then they'll get to the panel piece. So just so we're clear, right? So this is sort of the setup. So they talked about Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene being Christian nationalists as like the representatives already in office. Now, again, if you're just tuning in, if you skipped ahead, both of those ladies need some serious teaching as far as hermeneutics, exegetical work, all of that. They both have frequently, as far as I can tell, used the scripture incorrectly. Secondly, they switch after that to Doug Wilson as the sort of the figurehead church-wise of Christian nationalism. Now, again, don't miss the subtle connection there. They're basically connecting Wilson to, and actually this does get stated later on in the panel interview or the roundtable. They're basically connecting Wilson and Marjorie and Lauren as all in one group under one umbrella, which is an odd thing to make, but because they're all saying, like, they all consider them saying the same thing, then they put them all under the same umbrella, which, again, this is a cursory view, like a far outside view that I'm looking at. I don't know a lot about Lauren. I don't know a lot about Marjorie. I don't know a ton about Doug. I know more about Doug than I know about them two, but Doug would disagree, I think, with Marjorie and Lauren in regards to at least their use of scripture at the very least. But that's an assumption. So let's go ahead and get to the roundtable part, because that's pretty interesting as far as unpacking everything we just watched.
Are likely to impact where we are headed with both political parties. Next. Welcome back. We've ingested a lot, so let's do some digestion. We brought together a panel of experts. NBC News correspondent Ann Thompson, who was just in Moscow, Idaho. Andrew Whitehead, he's a professor of sociology at IUPUI in Indianapolis, and he's the lead author of Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. Former Republican Congressman Carlos Curbelo of Florida is also an NBC News political analyst. And Anthea Butler is chair of religious studies at the University of Pennsylvania and author of White Evangelical Racism. Welcome to all of you. And let me start here, which is you went there, you did this piece. There's a lot of concern about what's happening. After doing this piece, are we making too much of what's happening with Christian nationalism, or is this the beginning of something?
No, I don't think we're making too much of it, Chuck. I asked Reverend Stevens, who's in the piece, who opposes what Pastor Wilson is doing. I asked her, I said, are you crazed that I only show up, people like me only show up to ask questions about Christ Church? And she said no, she feels that the country needs to know about this, that there are people out there who want to take the country back to a more Christian culture.
So that's an important note, right? So basically what's happening, if I'm watching this piece, and again, I can't be totally unbiased because that's just impossible. But if I'm watching this, what I'm basically seeing is that what they're saying is, okay, Doug Wilson is 100% the figurehead of Christian nationalism, according to this piece. And so everything they sort of attach to Doug is the representation of what Christian nationalism then is, according to them, I guess, supposed to look like. So if anything looks like what Doug Wilson is presented as, then it's connected to Christian nationalism. And she is saying that Wilson wants to take the country back to a more Christian idea, like back. Now, again, you're going to hear this, which is going to contradict a little bit with what the next guy says. But the idea here is that they want to take Christian nationalism, specifically Doug Wilson, wants to take the country backwards. So there is this real idea of progressivism versus, I don't know if you want to call it reductionism or something along those lines, but the idea is that Christianity in general, but definitely Christian nationalism, is seen as going backwards. So anything you're enjoying now, and Roe versus Wade will come up in this discussion, but it's being presented that Christian nationalism is the backwards way. You don't want the backwards way, so you don't want Christian nationalism. And then Doug Wilson, if you have a question about what Christian nationalism looks like, there's Doug, and you can surmise from there according to this piece.
And so I don't think we're making too much of it. It certainly is a strong movement. You see it in our politics today. Will it have legs? It seems to, at least in Moscow, have reached a certain, it's reached its limits, I think, and it will not grow any further unless they import people.
Andrew, do you think there are degrees of Christian nationalism?
Yeah, there really are.
Now, he's going to give us degrees of Christian nationalism. Now, basically, he's just going to give us two, but they are an important two, and then he'll like add a third on that's not technically under the heading of Christian nationalism. So listen to the difference. Now, he gives us sort of good information. Here in a minute, we're going to get like really good breakdown from somebody else in regards to like really the nuts and bolts of the situation. But I think he gives us a good start here in regards to defining at least what this piece is presenting as a spectrum of Christian nationalism.
So when we survey the American public, we find that Christian nationalism is really a spectrum where you have Americans on the very upper end who strongly embrace these ideas that the U.S. is a Christian nation, that it plays a special role in God's work in the world globally, all of those things. And then you have Americans that think Christianity should play a role in American society, but wouldn't go so far as to say it should be privileged. And then we find that there are many Americans that resist and reject Christian nationalism as well. And so the important thing is that it's not
So basically, there's two types that he's describing, and there'll be people in the middle, of course, but he's basically describing what he would consider, I guess, two ends. Now, again, full transparency, have not read his book. Do not know if that is an accurate representation, but that seems to be what he's presenting here. There's basically there's two ends. One of them is the one that wants to be a Christian nation and or wants to take it back to a Christian nation or their version of a Christian nation, and they think that there's like this important role that America has to play in God's plan in the world. And then his other side seems to be people that, is important and thinks it should play a role in society, but not a privileged role. So that's basically the two ends. So if you fit anywhere in there, so you don't have to be a quote-unquote Doug Wilson, but if you fit anywhere on that spectrum, technically, from what I'm understanding from him, he would declare you to be a Christian nationalist. Now, if you feel like that's a little gray and not really like helpful, here in a minute, we're going to get a much more helpful definition, I think, that really helps us see sort of how at least this piece is framing Christian nationalism. So he says there's basically two spectrums, or there's two ends to the spectrum, and then there's people outside of that just think it's bad altogether.
not a binary either or, but that it's a spectrum of belief and strength of embrace of these different ideologies and ideals.
Yeah, and Thea, where would you draw the line? Because there are many people on the left side of the political spectrum who say, yeah, you should incorporate more teachings of the Bible into your public policy. But what is that line where it becomes Christian nationalism?
I think. Okay, this is incredibly important. Out of everybody on this panel, I think she gives the clearest view of what everybody at this table would probably consider Christian nationalism. Now, I want to pause it so you can prepare yourself, because you need to listen carefully to what she says, right? So she's going to mention, I'm just going to prep you on this, she's going to mention violence, but I want you to listen to what her definition of violence is, right? Because if somebody says violence is bad, everybody I know is going to say, of course that's true. But the definition of violence is what's important here. So just keep that, listen closely. On everything you watch, can I just say, no matter what it is, you should be listening closely and really trying to say, okay, well, what are they actually saying here? What is being communicated?
The line becomes when people become so dogmatic that they want to step over into a violent space. And what I mean by that is the people who want to impose something on someone else. I think one of the great things about America is that it's a democracy, right? And that America got started by people who were escaping religious autonomy so they could have religious freedom. And so one of the things I think is really important here in the delineation between what is Christian nationalism and what is not Christian nationalism is what are people trying to impose? Are they trying to use their Christian nationalism to do a takeover? And
so she's going to say something else that's really important here in a minute. So I just want to stop because I want to make sure we distinguish the two. So she said that it's a problem, like the line for Christian nationalism or not Christian nationalism is when it becomes violent. And I think she doesn't say it, and she may not be alluding to this, but I think right now, especially if you watch a lot of cable news, what you're hearing probably is like January 6th. So everybody goes, yeah, violence is not the answer not the answer, like bad. Violent takeovers, bad things, right? It is not first 5 on the list, okay? So I think everybody's like, yeah, violence is terrible. But then she goes on to define violence and says violence is anything you want to impose on someone else. Now, again, she's being incredibly vague, but again, this is phrased within the idea of LGBTQ rights. This is phrased within Roe versus Wade. This is phrased as far as like patriarchy, complementarianism. So what I think she's saying here by hearing this, and again, this is maybe a little subjective, but what I'm hearing is she's saying that Christian nationalism is any time you take your Christian belief and say, this should be law, okay? So if Christians say abortion is murder and we should have a law that outlaws abortion, I think what she's saying is that, well, that's technically violence because you're imposing a belief system on somebody else that they don't hold. Now, this whole argument falls apart clearly whenever you get into rule of law and the laws that are on the books, because clearly a country has to have laws. A people group have to have laws. And somebody's morality, someone's right and wrong is going to dictate those. Again, going back to the culture war that he mentioned before, creating culture, cultures clash. So the idea is whose culture is going to be the one that decides this right, wrong, or not. So what she's saying is Christian nationalism on the line, if you're a Christian nationalist or not, is do you want your Christian values to then interpret law that then imposes something on somebody else, whether that be LGBTQ marriage or not marriage, whether that includes abortion or not abortion, or a myriad of other things. The idea here being that it's Christian nationalism all the time if it's imposing something through the law onto someone else. So just keep that. I mean, that's an important distinguish to make here as regards to how are we classifying Christian nationalism, who fits into Christian nationalism, all of that. So now she's going to say something else that's, I think, interesting as well.
And then finally, who gets to be included as a Christian, in America? And I think that's a really important part.
So that's important too, right? So that goes back to the piece where Doug was being interviewed, and then those two other pastors in Moscow were being interviewed. That who gets to be a Christian then, right? Now, historically, again, I'm not going to fault anybody on this panel because I don't know how much they know about church history, right? Now, I think he mentioned that she had I don't know, she's a professor, I think, in church something. I just don't know what it is. But the point is that historically within the church, if you're going back all the way to the Apostles' Creed being formed, the Nicene Creed being put together, the councils that happened after that, like all of these are lines in the sand. This is what it means to believe. This is what it means to be a Christian. This is what it means to identify, within the belief of following Jesus. These have all been lines in the sand. So this idea of saying, well, who gets to be a Christian or not is basically saying Christian nationalists are those that say these people are Christians, these people aren't. Again, based upon their belief system. So I just want to flesh this out here. When I'm watching this, I'm going, okay, this isn't really framed in a political way because we haven't talked about Lauren or Marjorie since the beginning. Basically, they were a connective piece to get to Doug Wilson. Doug Wilson is now held up as the sort of prototype of the Christian nationalist, and it's very clear that he's patriarchal, that he's against LGBTQ rights, and they don't say anything about abortion in the piece, but he's against abortion. And then he's forming a culture in Moscow, which they say, like, it's not going to get any bigger, but it is an example of what Christian nationalism looks like. We then come to the panel and we get a little bit more working out of that, which basically tells us that if you believe Christian values are important at all within the nation, you kind of fit on the spectrum. And then we get even more clarification here saying that you're a Christian nationalist if you want to impose anything on other people because of your belief system. So this is helpful in regards to clarifying, but it also should sort of be like, if you fit in that category, just so you know, they're defining you as a Christian nationalist. And there's certain things, pretty negative things in this piece, that they are then connecting you to based upon that. And that's important to know because this is all about elections. This is all about politics. This is all about putting people in categories. So you know who's on your side and who's not, basically. Here we go.
Carlos, I want to put together two things. One is from a former colleague of yours, Adam Kinzinger. But before I get to his comments, I want to play a piece of sound from the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, Al Mohler, who absolutely embraces this label. Take a listen.
We have the left routinely speaking of me and of others as Christian nationalists, as if we're supposed to be running from that. I'm not about to run from that.
And an Adam Kinzinger.
Now, here's an interesting thing, right, with that. I don't know where Albert Mohler stands on the definition of Christian nationalism. But as the piece frames it, Albert Mohler is directly connected to Christian nationalism as it's understood in its connection to Doug Wilson. That's how it's framed, at least, which is ironic because on Twitter not too long ago, Mohler made it pretty clear that he didn't want to be associated with Wilson, or at least sort of made a point that he didn't want his work to be associated with Wilson or Canon Press. So this connection is funny in light of what we know happened on Twitter. But anyway, for the person that doesn't know any of that, Albert Mohler, which is a much more recognizable figure than Doug Wilson, just be frank, is being connected to Christian nationalism. And I don't know if when he's in this is where quotes and video clips are not helpful, because we don't know if his definition of Christian nationalism is the same as Doug Wilson's or as the same of what's being described on this panel. But he would probably fit into the category of Christian nationalism based upon, the idea that there are Christian beliefs, people should, law should be based on those Christian beliefs. So, I mean, technically he fits there, but the direct connection is being made between him and Wilson, which I don't know if that's accurate or not.
Tweeted when Marjorie Taylor Greene said something similar, we need to prove to people we are the party of Christian nationalism. He tweeted, he then quoted, he put in what he says is a quote from the Taliban that says, we are the party of Islamic nationalism. And then he writes, I oppose the American Taliban. And he then signals Kevin McCarthy.
So here's what I was talking about before with Marjorie Taylor Greene. So she was used at the beginning as like the prototype for Republicans are buying into Christian nationalism. When this tweet from Adam Kinzinger, and again, I know nothing about politics, right? I don't get a whole lot involved. So I don't know if he would be considered on the fringes of the Republican Party or not. I have no clue. But the point is, this does demonstrate that the Republican Party as a whole, as was presented at the beginning of this piece, does not necessarily agree with Marjorie Taylor Greene, even though it was sort of set up to be that.
McCarthy and what is happening inside the GOP on this issue?
Well, what Kinzinger is pointing out is the hypocrisy in all of this. It has been Republicans and conservatives over the years who have criticized other countries, like Muslim countries, for imposing religious beliefs and practices, and also for attacking communist countries for imposing atheism and banning people from practicing their religion. So what's happened here? That this has become a part of the culture wars. And this is the bunker mentality that Donald Trump and other conservatives have pushed a lot of the population into thinking that they're under assault. And I think, look, we have to be sensitive. The pace of cultural change in our country has been pretty rapid in recent decades. I think
depends
social
who you
media.
Are.
Yeah.
Okay. Like it's rapid for some, it's really slow for others.
So here's two things, right? So there's an acknowledgement here that cultural shifting affects everybody differently. So, right. So apparently, I mean, everybody in that I can see as far as like laughing about what he just said would probably fall more in the progressive space and saying things are moving way too slow. Whereas Doug Wilson, Albert Mohler, myself would say things are moving way too fast, right? So there's a clear divide. I think that's pretty clear in regards to that there's a clear divide in the country in regards to what's moving too fast, what's moving too slow. Secondly, it's being presented by this gentleman that Christian nationalism is like a takeover from the top down, which I would agree is a terrible idea. You taking over from the government and then imposing things on people is not the right way to do it. It's just stupid. I don't, as far as anything I've read from Wilson, anything we saw at least in this piece as was presented, he's not attempting to do that. And again, could be wrong. Prove me. I mean, if you have something, let me know and I'll read it. But everything I've read from him is bottom up. It's make disciples. Disciples of Jesus will go out into the culture with their culture and infuse the culture. And as that happens, there will be people that are Christians that run for office that then make decisions based upon their belief system. Literally like everybody else does, making decisions based on their belief system. So that will just out of naturally happen. But it's being presented that Christian nationalism wants to go top down and impose everything Taliban style on the rest of the country. And the reference points that they seem to be using to reference that are, for example, Roe versus Wade, specifically, which, again, I think it's a mischaracterization. Just like watching this as many times as I had, I think this is like the fifth watch through. I think it's a mischaracterization of Christian nationalism. If you want to like, as it's been defined on this panel, because Christians are naturally going to go do discipleship. Church is going to grow. More Christians are going to pop up. And as they do, culture will form. And then as culture forms, Christians will do things as everyone else does, which is start businesses, run for office. Those sorts of things will happen as Christians make disciples. So I don't think, I've never heard, like literally no one, maybe there's somebody out there that you know of, that is saying top-down mentality. Now, again, I think it could maybe be argued. Lauren and Marjorie are making those arguments, but I think it could also be arguing they're saying that I'm a believer and therefore I'm going to make decisions based on my beliefs, which is still bottom-up, not top-down, in my opinion. But let's keep going.
I mean, but we have to understand that some people increasingly feel excluded, left behind, and obviously that generates a lot of anxiety, and that's why people act out in these ways. But when it comes to our leaders, I think Kinzinger is right. I mean, we have to be consistent, and we can't be hypocritical in saying, these countries shouldn't do this and that, but it's okay for us to do it here because it's the religion that we prefer.
Andrew, what do you make of this active debate inside the GOP?
Yeah, it's really fascinating because really when we look at it, Christian nationalism, and Anthea brought this up earlier, is about power. And when we think of that in terms of a democracy and a functioning democracy, it's about sharing power and playing by the same rules. And so with Christian nationalism, we find over and over that if it comes down to democracy or power, they're going to choose power every time. And so this idea...
See, I would argue that that's not accurate. Like, that if you look at politics is always about power because you have to have power to enact certain laws and legislations. So anybody that's in politics, obviously, as far as democratically elected, you get in there by the votes. But if you get in there by the votes and you've been voted in, then you are now in there to enact certain things by the will of the people. And that's what you're supposed to do. But it is a power thing. This is why people campaign. This is why they put out, trashing ads against their opponents, because I'm better than this guy. I'm going to do this for you. And by the very nature of saying I'm going to do this for you is saying that when I'm in power, when you elect me, it's the same thing, then I will do this, that, or the other thing. So it's interesting that Christian nationalism, as it's been represented in this piece, is being said to be all about power, not about democracy, even to the case of, like, let's go back to the piece where they talk about Doug Wilson's church members running for office. They're still trying to go through a democratically elected route. And then when they don't get it, it's not like they try to take over the town. They just try again later. Now, again, apparently not to much success, but they are technically going through a democratic process. Now, again, he may be the undercurrent for what he's saying, maybe January 6th, but the exception isn't the rule, basically. I mean, it's an interesting argument.
of a country for the people, by the people. It's really a country for a particular people, by a particular people. And so for those in the GOP, trying to figure out, are we really about democracy where we're going to play by the same rules or not? And that's the big question, I think, at stake.
You know, and one of the things that I think some of us have struggled to sort of get our arms around is how are Lauren Boebert and Mark.
Okay, so this is the part that they don't understand, because I don't think they just don't understand how Christianity and the church aren't one big junk drawer category. Because he's about to make a point here about Lauren and Marjorie and Doug, which that if you knew the actual culture of the church, you would know that this isn't a hard thing to understand. But let's watch it real quick.
Marjorie Taylor Greene, two female Republicans, such big advocates of Christian nationalism, and you had this gentleman on who is made it clear every marriage is a kingdom and the man is the king.
Right.
I mean, it is sort of like this is one of those where it's hard to wrap my arms around that.
It absolutely is. And I asked.
So real quick, that was a misquote. Wilson actually said every marriage is a little kingdom and every husband a little king, asserting that Christ is over the whole thing. And that's something I get. I'm not going to hold him against him. He doesn't get it. He does not know the structure of a Christian marriage, so that's fine. But that is a key difference in what Doug was saying versus what is being presented here. Right? So even if you don't agree with complementarianism or patriarchy and you're an egalitarian, that's still a misrepresentation of what Doug said.
I mean, like I said, why can't you be equal in a marriage? And he's like, well, we weren't made that way to be equal. And I thought, this is not about biology. It's about intelligence. It's about dignity. It's about who you are. But that's not how he looks at it. He takes a very literal reading of the Bible. And I can't understand why a woman would submit to this.
So I just want you to hear that, right? She is incredibly confused about why a Christian woman would submit to her Christian husband in a way that the Bible prescribes. And this is one of the things in this piece that I hope that like believers watch and see, is that there is this disconnect between progressivism and, let's just call it conservatism for lack of a better term, that they don't understand that Christians really do believe what the scriptures say. Like they are good for the authority and how to live life and to reprove and rebuke us. And like we believe in the scriptures that they are the how to live your life rightly in this world. And the idea, like you can see that part in the interview that, like, I don't know what wave of feminism she believes in, but you can tell there's an enormous disconnect there, that she just cannot fathom that. And I think that should be sort of a wake-up call to some believers that are watching this, instead of being like, haha, she doesn't understand. Like no, she legitimately doesn't get it. Because she apparently hasn't been around anybody that either lives that way, demonstrates, a Christian marriage lived out like we see sort of in Ephesians 5 as it's sort of, painted for us. And when she's met with that, it's just like incredibly confusing to her. So let's keep going. We're almost done with this. I think we got a couple minutes left. Guys, I will break in here. If you appreciate stuff like this, make sure you like the video. That helps the algorithm. If you're not subscribed, make sure you subscribe. And I would love to hear any comments that maybe you have on this piece. I'll have a little bit of time here to talk about those here at the end.
Let's pivot. How much to the campaign trope? I think a lot of these self-described Christian nationalists, statewide level, Carlos, are going to lose. It's probably, I think Doug Mastriano is more likely to lose than win. He's running an odd campaign. But just being the nominee, haven't the seeds been planted for more of these candidates to run?
Well, it depends, Chuck. I mean, this could be part of the trap that Republicans have set up for themselves, where they elect the most quote-unquote conservative candidate out of primaries, and then these people just can't win. So eventually, this movement will likely just be extinguished because people get tired of losing. That's one theory. But certainly, I mean, it shows that at least there is a critical mass of support that can get these people past primaries. And by the way, going back to Christianity, and Ann, maybe you could shed some light on this, but Christianity. I mean, Jesus Christ invited people to follow. Never, it was never an imposition, right? Because
let's put it like that. He did not twist their arm. You could come or not. You know, you want to follow this guy, you don't. Yeah. That's all it is.
So that's interesting, right? Is that it's pretty clear that a majority of the people, at least this gentleman in the red striped tie and the lady that interviewed Wilson, don't understand like basic teachings of Christianity. I think Athela, I think is her name. I can't remember. It starts with an A. She has some sort of idea. I mean, again, I think it's a very loose idea, but she has an idea. And then the guy that wrote the book, the bald guy with the gray jacket, seems to probably have a little bit of idea because he wrote a book. So he had to do some research on Christianity. But the idea here that Jesus is like, oh, come along, guys, if you want, no big deal. If you want to chill, you can chill. You like my vibe? Cool, hang out with me. Is a misrepresentation of what we see in the Gospels. His first thing on the scene before is repent and believe. And then constantly is telling people what it's going to, like the sacrifice they're going to have to make to follow him. So when the big crowds are around him because they want miracles and they want food, he often says, you know, I know why you're here. He doesn't want the people that are just, you know, coming along for the good stuff. He knows it's going to be costly, and he often reminds them of that. And again, I don't think that if they were trying to present Christian nationalism as this arm twisting from the top down mentality, they kind of failed at that, because Doug doesn't come off as that guy that's going to twist your arm. He clearly said we're making a culture. That culture is going to go out. And then as that culture goes out, it fights the culture around it that obviously has competing views, and then we'll see what happens. So it's interesting, this take of top down, which hasn't really been modeled very well, other than this idea that your beliefs dictate law, therefore you're being violent.
You're concerned that this spreads, that even these losing Christian nationalist candidates, by losing, they've been mainstreamed. I mean, you know, we're going to get criticized doing this program because, hey, you're going to bring more attention, and that attention inevitably is going to lead to people, oh, it's more mainstream than I thought.
Yeah, and I think one of the important things to remember is that if we don't pay attention to this right now, we may be on the losing end later. I think, you know, to tie off of this comment about the GOP has had slogans like this a long time. It's been, whether it's been Make America Great Again or American Exceptionalism, all these kinds of things, right?
So the idea here is that American exceptionalism, Make America Great Again, are all being tied into Christian nationalism. Also, it's been stated pretty bluntly here that if you see somebody that fits into the category of Christian nationalism, as it's been presented on this panel, so you're against abortion, you're against LGBTQ marriage, you're even slightly for some sort of complementarianism, patriarchy, all of these things, you fit into this idea that Christian nationalism is a top-down mentality. And what is being stated right now is that if you see someone running that fits that category, you need to nip it in the bud now. Because if you don't nip it in the bud now, it gains momentum, and they may get elected, and then they may do these terrible things to you and oppose you in this, that, or the other way. And that's what's being clearly stated here.
Right. What is more interesting right now is that the religious and the political are being put together. Yeah. And that makes for a very powerful mix. And I think whether or not people win in November, we still have to contend with this in 2024.
And there's something else, though, going on here, which is sort of the country's growing more secular, which almost at the exact same time, those that are religious are almost becoming more fundamentalist.
Right.
So that's the key that I mentioned earlier, right? So he is right. There's a whole nother video I want to do on an NPR report that came out the other day in regards to like numbers of people that are leaving the church and the projected percentage in like 10 years. It's an incredibly interesting report. Hopefully I'll have time to make that video soon. But he is correct. So we do have these things happening all at once, right? So the nation is growing more secular. And he says that those that are religious are growing more fundamental. I think what's happened here, just from a person that's been in church most of my life, like looking at this, is that what's happened is the people that said they believed in Jesus for the sake of some sort of benefit culturally or some sort of just tradition, those people have slowly begun to fall off. And then you have people that are left in the church that recognize that the culture is changing around them, And they weren't prepared for that. They were like, hold on a second. I thought we had some sort of stability here. And now they're going, well, what do I really believe then? And those beliefs are becoming more solid than they once were. Those people are getting more outspoken than they once were. So it's being seen as they're becoming more fundamental, even though they're just actually solidifying their views more, and they're getting louder, just like those that are secular are getting louder, because there is this tension, as Doug mentioned in that piece. There is the pretty strong divide, and the tensions between these groups are really high.
But almost out of fear of this growing secularization.
And that's what I think it gets to, is that there is a great deal of fear. And if you look at the issues that they grab onto, the issue of abortion, the issue of same-sex marriage, opposing same-sex marriage, the issue of gender identity, all of those are driven by fear. Mm-hmm. And I asked Pastor Wilson that. I said, America is becoming less Christian. Fewer Americans want to be part of organized religion. And he just sees that as a further challenge. He believes he can change minds.
So interesting. Like, I'd be interested to actually hear what Doug responded to that by. But the idea here is that Christians that fit under Christian nationalism are responding out of fear to these things, not responding out of just core beliefs, right? And that's an important difference, because if you are responding at all against the three things you mentioned, gender identity, abortion, or LGBTQ rights, if you respond at all against those things, you are being perceived as being in response because you're afraid that those things are becoming more prominent. Not that you simply think that those things are sinful. So that's an important distinction. The perception is you're responding out of fear, not out of belief, like basic belief.
And Andrew, is it almost a feature that Moscow is the place trying to do this because they almost want to be reactionary to the majority of the population? It's easier to find fundamentalists in a place that maybe you feel like you're the outsider?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the insights of sociology is it's easiest to find who we are when we know who we're not. And so when you can define yourself against who you're not, that's really powerful. It creates very powerful in-group bonds. We're going to pull together. We're going to face the outside threat, the things that we're afraid of, and it becomes a really central part of your identity. And that's what's so powerful about Christian nationalism.
All right. Now, I would say he's right, but that's also what's very powerful about progressivism, or being part of the LGBTQ plus community, or being a part of any community. Every community, like, here's the thing. It's really funny how often we all do this, that we're like, oh, those people do this thing, that, or the other, right? So this idea is that Christian nationalism react out of fear and identify themselves opposed to everybody else. So does every other group. Literally every other group goes, I'm not like that group. I identify with you guys. So now we're a group. So do Christian nationalists do that? Probably yes. Literally like every other group. So it sounds profound when it's not really profound, because literally every group does this. It's funny that it's being pegged and pinned on Christian nationalism, in this case, as Christian nationalism is being defined in this piece.
All right, the separation of church and state. How strong is this still in our country, Anthea?
I think the idea of it is very strong. The reality of it is not. And, if we think back to Christian Coalition and all of these other groups that were passing out voter guides in the churches in the 1990s, if we think about the ways in which, Trump voters invoked all of this, and Trump himself invoked this, we think about the ways in which candidates now really play to all of this. I would say that the separation of church and state is very thin, if not non-existent.
Very quick.
See, it's odd that she says that, because every candidate that we've seen presented, with the exception of Lauren and Marjorie Taylor Greene, are all candidates they're like, oh, these people are posed to lose. But why would they be poised to lose then? Because, you're going to lose if you don't have the votes. And if you don't have the votes, you don't have a big groundswell. And if you don't have a big groundswell, that means that people don't believe the same thing you do, which means that if these candidates that are running that are Christian nationalists are, if the idea of church and state is just a magical idea that's never, like, it's gone now, then would not these candidates have more support? It's just that the logic doesn't seem to add up. If Christian nationalism is a big threat and the church and state separation is non-existent, would not there be more groundswell for quote unquote Christian nationalism at candidates though in this entire piece we've been told that there is no groundswell for Christian national candidates, and it's a thing, but don't worry about it, because if they don't get elected, it won't be a big deal. Like, I don't know. It's very back and forth. It's not consistent.
Quickly, Carlos, if you tried to run a campaign that said, I'm going to be so strict about separating church and state, I'm not even going to try to campaign at churches, could you win?
I think so. It depends where in the country, but in more suburban districts, I think you still could.
You're more optimistic about it
in rural
than I
areas,
thought.
much harder.
All right. What a terrific.
So it's interesting. I don't clearly the clip from Lauren was her campaigning in a church, but where I'm at, I'm in Indiana. I don't know of anybody that's campaigned in a church. In fact, campaigning in a church, at least in my circles, would be seen as, you don't do that. Like, that is not what the church is for. The church is for the gathering of the saints, for the worship of Jesus, and the declaration of the gospel. So that's an odd take, but apparently it does happen, clearly. So anyway, I think this is about, I think this is the end.
Terrific conversation. Thank you all. Thank you all for being with us on this first episode of our 5th season here.
Yeah, so that's the end of it, right? So there's the big hoo-ha end of the piece that they did. So the general idea that is at least being presented is that there are at least a couple candidates that have already been elected. They named Lauren and Marjorie as candidates that have already been elected that are Christian. So, I mean, they've stated that they're Christian nationalists. And then they switch over to Doug Wilson, and he is presented as the figurehead of Christian nationalism. And then we go through and all the connection that this is what Christian nationalism stands for is the same thing Doug Wilson stands for. And then if you are even close to the same thing Wilson stands for, you are a Christian nationalist, even if you disagree with him on a lot of things and you think that even Christian belief should play a little bit of role in society. Even if it's not a privileged role, you're at least still on the spectrum, according to that sociologist. And then we got even a clearer picture is that Christian nationalism is 100% when you go to violence, but violence is defined as your belief being put into law over other people, regardless of what that belief is. So, for example, abortion, gender identity, LGBTQ rights. If you oppose any of those things, it's violence and you fit under Christian nationalism, according to the panel, and you're in the same category as Doug Wilson and Marjorie and Lauren, even though that is an umbrella that's really crazy. So, we do have one comment here. Let me see if I can put, let's see here. Well, it's up there. Oh, but I can't see it because it's okay. Well, I'll read it off. It says, it's hard for me to hear what those against Christian nationalism, talk about, and for them not to sound like they're against Christianity. That's sort of the point, right? So really what it boils down to here is this idea that if you hold it all to what would probably be considered Orthodox Christianity, like if you think the Bible is at all authoritative in your life, and that affects how you actually live in society, then you seem to fit in this category, which again is incredibly broad. That's an incredibly broad category, but it's important to realize that because apparently, according to at least this panel, this piece that was done, Christian nationalism equals bad for society. Christian nationalism is defined as anyone that believes your belief should affect law and culture as you live in it, at any level, even if it's at the one end of the spectrum. And that if any candidate runs at all that is considered Christian nationalist, it should be nipped in the bud right away. The thing that's very ironic here is that Christian nationalism, at least presented in this piece, is seen as something that wants to take over from the top down. Therefore, it should be done away with. If anybody even identifies as it, take care of it now. But ignores the reality that everyone, Christian or otherwise, operates out of a belief system. And that belief system, when they get into office, if they're democratically elected, if they get into office, will then affect how they vote. So it's basically saying, unless I'm mishearing this entire piece, that if you're Christian, you definitely don't belong in office because those Christian beliefs will influence how you vote, and your vote then oppresses people. Therefore, don't vote for Christians, because if you vote for Christians, then they're going to oppose you. The really interesting part is voting for Christian nationalism is connected to Trump. It's connected to Al Mohler. It's connected to Doug Wilson. It's connected to Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren, which ironically, like, it's this huge umbrella to cover all these people, even though if you were to actually like delve into each of their belief systems and if they support or if these are even connected, they are so loosely connected that it's hilarious that they're all put in the same category, but they have to lump them into the same category in order to make this definition work. Another comment that's put in, some people think that we can live in such a way that my beliefs affect no one else, which is fundamentally a belief system that informs how we treat those who are, quote, dogmatic. Yeah. I mean, there's this idea, it just doesn't work. If you have a belief system, it is going to affect other people because of how you live. If you don't think, for example, if you don't think stealing is wrong and you live in that way, it is 100% going to affect someone else. If you think, being a thief is incorrect and you put into law that being a thief is the incorrect way to live life, then according to at least one person on that panel, you are committing violence against the person that doesn't believe the theft is an issue, and therefore you're imposing your beliefs on somebody. The system doesn't work. The idea that they're presenting here literally is held by everyone with a belief system, but it is very funneled down into, if you are opposed to abortion, if you're opposed to LGBTQ marriage, if you're opposed to anything gender theory, then you fit into Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is bad. Don't vote for Christian nationalists because they're going to oppress you. That is the piece in summation, unless I'm missing something. I don't think I am. And Doug Wilson, which ironically or not, they chose him, is very controversial even within Christianity. So you're automatically going to get some Christians that go, well, I don't want to be identified with that, and therefore back off. And if that wasn't enough, he's identified with Trump, so they're going to back off. Or, hey, they're identified with Albert Mohler, I'm going to back off. Or they're identified with Lauren or Marjorie Taylor Greene, so I'm going to back off. So there's a lot built into this report to make this incredibly negative and to make Christians that are just watching this, right? Not super theologically minded, maybe go to church every week, maybe go to church every once a month, go, I don't know if I want to be associated with that, and therefore affecting how they vote and what, how they decide, who they're going to vote for, who they're going to support. So the whole thing, anyway, that's my 2 cents. Interesting. Thank you guys that joined way longer than I expected it to be, but I appreciate you guys being here. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe. That helps the algorithm. Leave a like below. That helps the algorithm. And we'll be back with more content like this, later. I'll talk to you. Have a great one.